Honestly, I have been so torn between these two lenses for months now, but after this comparison, I finally know which one that I'm gonna have to let go. So today I'm gonna try and do the impossible. I'm gonna compare the RF 2870 2.8 to the RF 24-105 f4 to try and help you decide which one of these awesome standard zooms might be for you. And this might actually be the hardest question to answer right now on Canon RF mounts, so I'm gonna do my best. We've got a lot to get through, so let's get started. So obviously one of the biggest factors when choosing between these two lenses is their zoom range. Let's start at the wide end. Is the difference between 24 and 28mm actually that big of a deal? Right, so now I'm going to show you the difference between 24mm and 28mm. So how I'll do that is I'm going to frame up a shot at 24mm and grab a shot of this landscape. And then I'm going to zoom into 28mm. I'm going to step back until I match the frame of the 24mm shot that I just took, just to show how much extra space you need to get a similar shot. There. So as you can see, it's only actually a couple of steps back to get a very similar shot to 24mm at 28mm. So if you've got the space to play with outside, it's not really that big of a deal. 28 is never going to look the same as 24mm. I don't think it ever quite looks as dramatic, but like I've shown before, if you've got the space, it's usually just a couple of steps back to get a similar kind of frame. But the issue is not every situation gives you that space. So even outdoors, sometimes you are boxed in, and that's where those extra 4mm can really matter. So look at this example at this lake. I was stuck on this really narrow pathway where I couldn't just keep stepping back to get more in frame because it was kind of fenced off, it wasn't allowed to. So with the 2870, 28mm would have been as wide as I could go. So here's a side-by-side, same scene, first at 28mm and then 24mm. And yeah, 28mm does look good, but the 24mm shot really opens up the scene. I think it gives me that wider, more dramatic look that I really wanted for this particular shot. So on that day, if I'd only have had the 2870, I would have felt like I missed that shot, to be honest. And that's where those few extra millimeters can really count. Here's one more example. So I was at my friend Jeff's wedding in Venice recently on a gondola, and I'm sat at the back of the boat and I want to get wide shots showing where we are and what we're doing. And obviously I can't move back an inch. And honestly, I think both of these shots look fine, but it's just another example that no matter how rare, sometimes having that extra width to 24mm can really make a difference. But if we flip it, what about the long end with these lenses? So here's a quick look at the jump between 70mm and 105mm. And that extra reach at 105 just brings you noticeably closer to distant details, which can be super handy, whether you want to isolate a subject, compress a scene, or you just want to frame something tighter without having to crop in post. Here's a shot I got of a distant church where I couldn't physically get any closer because it was fenced off from this vantage point. And with the 24-105, I could zoom in much more. And you can see the difference here. Yes, I do prefer the 70mm shot, but still, it's nice to have that extra reach just in case you need it. I will say though that personally, when I'm using the 2870, there's far more scenarios where I find myself missing 24mm than I ever really miss 105mm. Because if I do need to get tighter than 70, I'll just crop. I don't mind cropping pretty heavily for the kind of things that I do, especially if the shots are just going to end up on social media. But of course, that same cropping advantage applies to 105mm as well, because you can push it even further without any noticeable quality loss to like 150mm, and then you can probably leave a telephoto lens at home. So that range of 24-105 cannot be underestimated. Being able to go from tight, distant details at 105 all the way into sweeping dramatic landscapes at 24mm and everything in between, all on one lens, is pretty incredible. And it genuinely does feel pretty freeing to just be out and about carrying one single lens and feeling like you're ready for pretty much anything. You're not having to constantly swap out lenses. You can just be in the moment, not worry about gear, and just capture whatever's in front of you. But what about rendering for things like portraits? Well, the 2870 has the advantage of a faster 2.8 aperture, which is going to give you a bit more background blur and subject separation, especially when you compare it to the 24-105's constant f4 aperture. But let's see how much of a difference it really makes. Here are some full-length portraits, starting with 28mm versus 24, just to show you again the difference in framing. And as we move through the zoom range, the depth of field difference at wider focal lengths on wide shots like this isn't huge. I picked this particular shot because if you keep an eye on the mountains in the background, they are noticeably smoother on the 28-70 because that faster aperture helps blur out those little details, especially as you move past 50mm. And all throughout the range, the f2.8 shots just have a little touch more of that kind of 3D quality that you might expect from a faster lens. But once you get past 70mm, the 24-105 starts to catch up a bit. At 105 f4 in particular, you get a very similar amount of subject to background separation that you get from 70mm f2.8. You just got a tighter crop, of course. So while it's not the same look by any means, the depth and isolation is definitely there in my opinion. Now, let's run it again, but this time with a bit of a tighter, more traditional portrait crop. Again, let me show you 24 versus 28, and you can see again that wider, more dramatic look at 24mm, but side by side, it does look a bit more flat compared to the 28mm f2.8 shot. Moving through the zoom range, I think the differences become a bit more subtle, but the 24-105 images, despite looking great, do feel a little bit more flat overall compared to the 2.8 images having that slightly nicer focus fall off. Once we're beyond 70mm though, on the 24-105, like at 85mm for example, I think you really start getting that subject isolation back. And when you zoom all the way out to 105 f4, it gets impressively close to what the 28-70 gives you at 2.8 at this crop as well. I tested it again, but this time with a more busy background to really see how these lenses handle a distracting background at these longer focal lengths. On the left, we got the 28-70 at 70mm 2.8, and on the right, we got the 24-105 at 84 and 105mm both at f4. And for this kind of a portrait, I think all of these look great, and in all of these shots, the background is blurred nicely and the subject is separated nicely. In this case, for me, picking between these shots, aperture would be in no way a deal breaker. I think they all deliver strong separation. In fact, I'd probably say the 105mm f4 shot is probably my favorite. That focal length offers a really nice flattering look at this kind of crop for portraits, and it gives you plenty of pop. And you even start to see a slight hint of a kind of swirling bokeh to the background, which adds a nice little bit of character to the image. But it's always really easy to over-examine things and look at images side by side in these kinds of tests, especially in more controlled conditions, but what about out in the real world? Here are a few travel shots that I've taken on both lenses in the same spot, side by side, and you tell me, do you see any real meaningful difference between that 2.8 and f4 aperture? Would it matter to you when picking between these shots in practice? Let me know down below. So personally, I do think the 28-70 has slightly nicer rendering for portraits, especially between 28 to 50mm. At those wider focal lengths, you get just a bit more depth and pop, as you'd expect from that faster 2.8 aperture. And I think this makes it the better choice for things like environmental portraits, where you want the context of the scene, but just a little bit extra subject separation. And on that note, talking about rendering, I think this particular 28-70 2.8 from Canon has fantastic rendering for a zoom lens like this. But if most of your portraits are shot beyond 70mm, then I'd say the differences even out pretty quickly. And in fact, you might actually prefer the look at say 105mm. It's really flattering, especially for head and shoulder portraits. And I think it gives you plenty of background blur as well. Now let's compare these lenses for sharpness. Let's take a look at those mid-length portraits we took earlier. These were all shot on the R6 Mark II. And working through, zoomed in at 300% from 24 to 50mm, both look really good in the center, with the 28-70 maybe having a slight bit more bite and contrast when examining fine details like eyes and the eyebrows. With both at 70mm, I would say the 28-70 has a very slight advantage in sharpness and clarity. And beyond this point, the 24-105 starts to drop off a little bit, but still maintains very good results. It just lacks some of that same clarity, in skin and eye detail that the 2870 manages to maintain all the way through the zoom range. I double checked this in slightly flatter lighting, this time on my 45 megapixel R5 Mark II for some more close-up portraits at the longer focal lengths, and as you can see, 85mm f4 looks very similar in terms of sharpness to the 70mm 2.8 image, but again, you can see at 105mm f4 there's a bit of a drop in clarity and sharpness, and it's more obvious on this more testing sensor. Now let's look at the corners, and again, I shot these on my R5 Mark II, focused on the corner of the hood, and this will show us just how well these lenses resolve detail in the edges of the frame. And at their widest focal lengths, wide open, both lenses look really, really good. And they're probably even in terms of sharpness, but the 2870 just has a slight bit extra contrast to the image. But by f8, both of these lenses are fantastic. There's maybe a bit more sharpness and clarity throughout the whole frame with the 2870 though. Zooming the 24-105 to 28mm to match, when wide open, it's a bit softer than the 2870, but once both are at f8, they're both perfect. At 35mm, the 2870 is noticeably better wide open in the corners, but by f8, again, both lenses are perfect. Beyond 50mm, I took this shot, this time focusing on the mountains in the edge of the frame. And at 50mm, the 24-105 looked really clear and really sharp to me wide open. Even at f8, I think the 24-105 is better. If we focus on those trees and all the details in the mountain, it is way clearer on the 24-105. At 70mm in the corners wide open, the 24-105 is marginally better, but neither look amazing to be honest, and by f8 they both look great. Let's zoom to 85 on the 24-105 where it performs about the same as 70mm 2.8 with maybe a touch more clarity for the 24-105. And by f8, the 2870 looks better in my opinion. At 105 f4 in the corners, the 24-105 is a bit soft to be honest, and strangely enough it softens up even more at f8, so it never really improves and the 2870 looks much better at its longest focal length. If you want to dive in deeper, you can download all of these files and take a look for yourself, and it might be worth doing too because I actually shot at a couple of different apertures, not just the ones I'm showing on screen, so you can check out central and edge sharpness across the full focal range of these lenses. And personally, I found the sharpness difference between these two lenses wasn't really that huge. The 2870 does have a slight edge in clarity and sharpness at more focal lengths, but you really only notice these kinds of differences when you zoom in way more than you'd ever really need to. One thing I really cannot stress enough though is make sure you test your own copy of these lenses, because in my experience, there is definitely some sample variation between all of these lenses, but especially with the 24-105. I've owned two brand new copies of the 24-105, I've rented it a bunch of times, I've bought it used, and honestly, all of the copies perform slightly differently. So for example, last time I tested these two lenses side by side, I rented that 24-105 and it just didn't perform that well. But maybe last year, I compared the 24-105 to the 24-70 2.8 and the results with that copy were way better, actually probably better than the copy that I have today. So these days I try to avoid hiring lenses whenever I can, so for this particular video, I actually just bought a brand new copy of the 24-105 just to make sure that I gave it the fairest shot possible. And it performed really well, very well, just not quite on the same level as the 28-70 2.8 in my opinion. Now the faster aperture on the 28-70 isn't just for that nice shallow depth of field of course, because it also gives you an extra stop of light, which can be really helpful in low light situations, but how big of a deal is it really? And the answer is, it depends. Sometimes that extra stop won't make much of a difference, but in more extreme situations like indoor sports, events, weddings, astrophotography, it can be the difference between a usable and unusable shot. I shot a couple of examples in different low light scenarios at different ISOs to show you what that might look like in practice, but ultimately, how much this matters is also totally camera dependent. On most of these Canon RF bodies, especially in what I would consider like a typical ISO range, say 800 to 6400 ISO, I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. These sensors are great, the noise is manageable, and modern software can clean up noise really well now as well.
I can keep the photo autofocus section short because both these lenses are amazing. So despite the fact the 24-105 uses USM motors and the 2870 uses STM motors, once upon a time that might have mattered, but Canon have done a great job with these new STM lenses. They perform just as good as USM, they are silent, they focus super fast, it's snappy and accurate, and you'll have no problems with photo autofocus. Now let's talk about video, where for me, a standard zoom like this is by far my favourite lens to use for video for most applications. And these two lenses have a lot to offer. They both got image stabilisation, they both cover a really versatile focal range, and both are ideal for things like travel or gimbal work and everyday kind of shooting. It was actually whilst I was comparing these two lenses for video, I think I finally made up my mind about which one of these lenses I want to keep. So let's take a quick look at how these two lenses compare in terms of rendering in video, and honestly, this difference really surprised me. As expected, the 2870 gives you a bit more background separation thanks to the faster aperture. The 24-105 f4 looks great, but when you see the footage side by side, the difference becomes a bit more obvious, I think. The 28-70 has a noticeably warmer tone, even though both of these clips were shot on the same camera with the same settings. To my eye, it also has a bit more of an organic, slightly softer rendering, whereas the 24-105 has a bit more of a flat video-ish look, for lack of a better word. The rendering from the 2870 is just really nice. I've been saying it since this lens was released, and it's not just the extra shallow depth of field, it's the overall feel of the image and the character. I just really prefer the look of clips from this lens for video for me personally. If we do put both clips side by side at every focal length, in my opinion, I feel like the background just looks more painterly and the character is just a bit nicer on the 2870. But everybody's use case and priorities are different, and that sheer focal range offered by the 24-105 is just so valuable for things like run and gun shooting, for travel or documentary work, where flexibility and versatility matters way more than rendering. So side by side, the difference is noticeable, but would you really spot it in a more realistic scenario? Take a look at these two sequences and let me know which of these clips, there's a lens A and a lens B, which one do you think was shot at f2.8? And it's pretty tricky to tell when you're not just watching them side by side, but lens A was shot on the 2870 2.8, so let me know if you guessed that right. And more importantly, after watching those clips, do you really think the difference in aperture made a difference? Would it sway you one way or another in which of these clips you might have used? So yeah, personally, when I compare them directly, I prefer the look of the 2870. It's got a bit more pop and character, and the overall warmer, more pleasing look gets me closer to the final result that I want in camera compared to the 24-105. And the faster aperture also gives me a bit more creative control that I think people that shoot more narrative and more creative stuff will really appreciate. It's also worth mentioning that I can stop the 2.8 lens down to f4 for a more flat video look if I want that. What do you think? Let me know which one you pick for video. Like we said earlier, the RF 2870 does have the advantage when it comes to low light video thanks to having a faster aperture. That's a full stop extra of light. But again, how much that really matters is just going to come down to your specific camera and how far you're pushing it. To show what I mean, these clips were all taken on the R5 Mark II, which is a camera that gets a bit of criticism for its high ISO performance. But side by side, that extra stop of light made even less of a difference than it did in photo mode, I think. None of these clips have had any extra noise reduction, and I'd be totally happy using either lens here if I needed to. Most modern RF cameras handle low light video really well, even up to 12,800 ISO in my opinion. Focus speed in video is amazing on both. Subject tracking is very reliable, and they both handle quick shifts from near to far very smoothly. If I had to pick a winner, it'd be the 2870, because I think, as you can see, it's a little bit more snappy when it comes to changing focus point. But the bottom line is both are incredibly fast and accurate and reliable for video, and these two lenses in particular are easily among the best performers at this price point on RF mount. Now, stabilisation is great in both of these lenses, but I do think the RF 2870 has a bit of an edge here. I'm not sure what Canon tweaked, but it feels like they've improved things slightly in these newer STM lenses. It's the same in my 16 to 28, I noticed improvement there as well. Footage from the 2870 just looks a bit more stable, and I also think I notice a bit of a reduction in those corner wobbles that we normally see in these kinds of clips. In terms of handling and build, these two zooms have a lot in common. Both are compact and easy to pack when you travel, and both are surprisingly lightweight on camera as well. That said, the 2870 feels smaller and lighter because it is, both on and off camera. I've used both of these lenses on everything from the R8 to the much larger Canon C80, and even over long, hot days traveling and wandering around abroad, I would honestly rather take either of these lenses over my 24 to 72.8 by far. But don't underestimate what that extra range on the 24 to 105 means, because it covers just so much more. It means that you are having to swap lenses way less often. So there's been times with the 2870 I've had to swap lens just to be able to get a shot at 24mm. One thing to note is that the RF 2870 has a unique collapsing design, so it needs to be extended out to 28mm before it's actually usable, which this helps keep the size down. It's nice for things like packing, but it can also slow you down on camera. If you just want to grab your camera and quickly get a shot, you've got to extend it out before it will actually function. Whereas with the 24 to 105, it's always ready to go. But overall, both lenses are really solidly built and handle very nicely on any Canon RF camera that I've tried them on. So to wrap up, honestly, I have been so torn between these two lenses for months now, but after this comparison, I finally know which one that I'm going to have to let go. I'm saying goodbye, unfortunately, to the 24 to 105, and it really does just come down to how important video is for me. The 28-72.8 just has a look that I really love. It's one of the nicest rendering zooms that I've ever used really at any price point, and just seeing those clips side by side really sealed it for me, because for my needs, the 2870 is just a perfect balance of image quality, character, versatility, and size and weight at this point. But don't get me wrong, if I wasn't making YouTube videos and I was just traveling with my wife, only taking photos, then 100% I would be keeping the 24 to 105, because that range for me for travel is just unbeatable. And honestly, most of the time when I'm traveling, I'm shooting at f4 anyway. And if I do want more background blur for a portrait or something, then I'll just bring along one of my smaller 1.8 primes. So for photography, focus travel, I would take the versatility of the 24 to 105 over the faster aperture any day. But the truth is, both of these lenses are amazing options for a standard zoom. You really can't go wrong, and if you already own one, there's very little need to jump ship to the other. These are two really strong options on RF mount, and it's kind of win-win whichever one you go with. And I could probably justify keeping both. I'd love to, but I really can't. I've already bought and sold both of these lenses more times than I dare admit over the last year or so. So now I want to hear from you guys. Which one of these lenses would you go for? Would you pick the 24 to 105 for the range and flexibility, or maybe the 2870 for the rendering and the pop for portraits? Let me know in the comments, and check the description. You'll find download links for the RAW files from earlier, as well as some links to other comparisons I've done in the past. They'll let you dive a little deeper into each of these lenses. But it was a long one. I really hope that it maybe helped you figure out which of these lenses might be the right one for you. I really tried, but that's it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.